Well, I just walked into the Freud Museum in London and fell in love with it. And I found myself so captivated by being surrounded by 2,500 antiquities, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, beautiful Chinese jade, exquisite Persian rugs. And I was so captivated, actually, I couldn't leave. I was like a character in Buñuel's Exterminating Angel. Like, I would get to the door and then I'd go, no, I've got to go back in and keep looking at these things, So I was totally enchanted. And I contacted the director of the museum and said that I had this idea for a book that would be something that would be available for a really broad audience. I mean, I'm not a Freudian, and I wasn't coming at it from that perspective. I was coming at it as an art historian who wanted to, I guess, reveal to as many people as possible just how exquisite and beautiful this collection was, primarily because to me they were objects of great beauty. And I think prior to that, people had looked at the works and had just seen them as exemplars of Freud's theories and said, there's a Sphinx, Oedipus and the Sphinx, so it's the whole Oedipus complex. Well, that would have been true if everything in the collection had exemplified his theories, but they didn't. I could see he was a really discerning and discriminating collector who had educated himself, who already came from a background of, serious high classical learning, which he had sort of gained, as a young man in Vienna. And then he travelled to Paris in about 1885, and there he'd encountered the wonderful collection of Egyptian art at the Louvre, second to none. He'd seen Egyptian art in Vienna, but it's nothing like the Louvre collection. That's an amazing collection, really stunning. And he'd seen that and it just, blown his mind, really. And he really wasn't able to start collecting for a while because he was quite broke. He'd started his practice. Psychoanalysis certainly wasn't fashionable, it wasn't well known, he just got married, so he had a lot of deterrence, initially, as to how he was actually going to collect. But as soon as he got a little bit of money, and as soon as he started travelling, he adored going to Italy, and so he'd go on, shopping expeditions. And so, for Freud, he was prescribing, psychoanalysis for his patients, but his therapy was shopping. He loved to shop, and he didn't want to stop shopping. And in fact, he drove people quite mad. He knew this. Like, he'd take his brother Alexander on these trips to Italy with him, and he'd say, look, poor Alexander, I run him off his feet because I want to rush around to every museum, and then every time I see a store saying Antiquities, I've got to rush in, and see what's there and buy as much as I can. And he loved haggling and, like doing deals with people. He liked the whole business of collecting. He enjoyed every aspect of it. The first thing he started collecting were books. His library was the first thing he began collecting. And he did that quite with, complete disdain for money. He'd be saying, yes, I'm sort of over my budget again. Never mind, I don't care. I'm going to get this marvellous new illustrated book. I simply must have it, The true shopper, absolutely acquisitive. So that was the first, and then from that, and of course he loved all the, archaeological digs, the big archaeological digs that were going on, like the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, that was very exciting for him. He read a great deal about the discovery of Troy, So there were all these sort of great buccaneering archaeologists in Freud's time as well, where all this was being discovered, literally dug up, and it'd be on the front page of all the papers, these exciting new digs, And he was always very keen to find out, what was coming out, and got a little bit involved in the old Tomb Raider stuff. There's a bit of the Indiana Jones about him, and there was a bit of illegal stuff that he would get involved in if he could, if people could sort of smuggle out some Roman artefacts from some dig out in Hungary or something, and he'd quite happily go along, knowing that it was illegal, but he'd still go along and see what he could buy, see what he could get out of it. And there's this famous comment about, this is when men begin to become collectors, is when they're 40. And yes, the death of his father was an extraordinary transition for Freud, because it seemed to mark a passage between into adulthood, into maturity, and also at the same time he was writing the interpretation of dreams, which is, the benchmark and the foundation stone of psychoanalysis. So he was, he really plunged, as he said, into the kind of innermost recesses of his buried self. He went really deeply, we would call it a depression, I suppose, where he went back in time, which of course is what psychoanalysis is about. It's going back to your earliest memories. It's exploring these, primal relationships with the mother and the father. And so Freud is going through this kind of really turbulent, deep kind of, and at the same time very creative sort of mode. And equally, he's kind of reaching out to artworks. And as he himself said, art is a great consolation. Beauty consoles you. And I think that's how the objects began to work for Freud in that way. So yes, Egyptian art is the mainstay of the collection, but there's a lot of very good Greek and Roman art as well, Roman glass, and some Chinese objects, and then people started giving him things as well, Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was his great friend and analyst and really took psychoanalysis forward in France. When he had to leave Vienna, she gave him some objects, to surround himself with when he got to London, because she realised how essential they were for his well-being, and I think his creativity. Just the way the sucking on the cigar, this is why a lot of writers can't give up smoking, is because it's a rhythm, about writing, pausing, smoking, writing, and this obviously was Freud's rhythm as well. And he never regretted smoking, even though it gave him cancer, any more than he regretted trying to get 2,500, artworks out of Vienna in the face of the Nazis, which he did. He didn't write, he never wrote specifically about collecting. I mean, I trawled through his writings to find different times that he spoke about the works that he'd acquired, for example. He does this quite a bit in interpretation of dreams, because this is when he's becoming a collector. This is when he's beginning to develop, this particular sort of obsession. And he refers to different objects that he's bought or sold or got rid of or whatever. And there's the recognition during that period that, for Freud, with the death of his father, art and mourning, collecting and death and grief, and then recognising that there's a creative process that's involved in this journey into his own underworld when his father Jacob dies. And that is really completely entwined with collecting art. He loathed modern art. He was a complete Philistine about contemporary art, wasn't interested in it at all. He wasn't going around collecting Baroque art or, there's a million things you can collect. There was no reason why he had to choose what he did. But I think it sort of connects to his own classical learning, his own fascination with the past. And I think, what Freud did, and one of his projects, in psychoanalysis, was to strip away what he thought was like a modern and a Christian abhorrence of sexuality, and, to go back to sort of a Greek idea of the body, and, to look at sexuality as something, excuse me, as something to be, honoured and glorified and worshipped, rather than something to be ashamed of and to be disgusted by. And that Freud hated that. He was really, really opposed to it. And I think it's something he shared with Jung. They both had that deep interest and admiration for classical Greek civilization, where, sexuality was regarded as something that was very much a part of life, and the body itself could be regarded as an object of beauty, not an object of shame. Erotic equivalents, and I think there's an erotic equivalent with the sort of the sucking of the cigar. And then of course he also said, a collector is like a Don Juan character, and he talked about himself as being a conquistador, I might be a man of science, but I'm really a conquistador. I think there's this idea of going out there and, getting things and being the first, And he was a great warrior, Freud. I mean, he had to fight for psychoanalysis, and he was really relentless when people turned against him. He would absolutely go for them and tear them apart, like poor old Jung when they had their falling out. So he was very strategic, Freud, about what he was doing with psychoanalysis. He didn't just let it happen, He saw to it that he was creating the kind of international networks. He always saw it as an international movement. But yeah, I think the collection also, even though it has all these fabulous goddesses in it, like Isis and Artemis and Athena, Freud's own attitude towards women and women's sexuality was problematic and phallic, the Oedipus complex and the castration theory is just like one of the dumbest things, he ever thought up. He didn't think up many dumb things, but that was a dumb thing, No, women don't want a penis. No, Freud, we don't. But that was a theory that he developed, and yet in his own life, in his own practice, he was very supportive of women lay analysts like Princess Marie Bonaparte, because he recognised that women weren't going to get into medical school. They weren't going to qualify in that way. So the role of the lay analyst, Freud always supported. He didn't want psychoanalysis to become too medicalised, which it in fact did after the Second World War in America. It became extremely medicalised. So, you can see him acting in this very concerted effort to bring women into psychoanalysis, and then on the other hand, proposing these views about castration that are just kind of idiotic. There was the zone of his study where the famous couch was, and where he would see his patients, which is crammed with all these beautiful objects. And then there's this very bourgeois apartment, where he lived his life with his wife Martha and their 6 children. And the furniture in there and the decorations are just bland, very, very ordinary. There's nothing special about them. And then you enter this exotic world, and patients would be sort of like really stunned when they would walk in and felt themselves to be in a kind of an Aladdin's cave or another world, a world where, they crossed the threshold, they left the sort of the mundane world behind and entered into this extraordinary sort of exotic zone where they will be taken care of, The Freud Museum only opened to the public 25 years ago, which sounds, and it's a real house museum. So you walk in and you experience the collection just as it was when Freud died. And while that I think is really fantastic, you really have to know your gods and goddesses, I suppose, to really know what you're looking at. And up until then, Freud's collection was in his private home in Vienna. It was really just about, his patients coming to see him. And I suppose because if he'd written about it, perhaps, if he'd devoted a couple of essays to my collection, we would know a little bit more about it. He did produce a catalogue during the First World War, which has been lost. So it's taken a long time for it to be dated, and researched properly, so we can begin to sort of unpack it. And while it's really rich and sort of fecund to see it as relating to his theories, which indeed it does, also they're just, objects of beauty in their own right. And I think that's what we need to sort of get a sense of as well. Of Freud the collector, all of this was channeling and funneling back into his imaginative and creative life. But it gave him great pleasure to simply be surrounded by these objects. And enough was never enough for Freud. When he thought he would lose the collection, he wouldn't be able to get it to London, he said, I'll just start again. I'll start a new collection. That's what I'll do.